I'm going to present the evidence that ultraviolet B irradiance and vitamin D reduce the risk of cancer. I have funding from a number of organizations, which I'm very thankful for. So I'm going to discuss today how vitamin D, the mechanisms that vitamin D reduces the risk of cancer, the types of evidence for benefits with findings from ecological studies to observational studies. Joan has already talked about the randomized controlled trial. Prostate cancer, I'll discuss that in a bit of detail because that's a little contentious. I'll then discuss Hill's criteria for causality in a biological system, the general benefits of increasing 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels, and mention my project with John Cannell's Vitamin D Council on 100 vitamin D sensitive health conditions. So there are a number of mechanisms whereby vitamin D may reduce the risk of cancer, and I think you've heard of many of these today, so we don't really have to go over these right now. There are four types of basic types of epidemiological studies that are used to identify and quantify links between risk-modifying factors and disease. The first three of these are called observational studies. You have the nested case control studies, where a population is followed for years after blood draw, and you look for cases in that cohort and then match them with controls. Unfortunately, the accuracy of this approach seems to decrease with time since the blood draw because vitamin D levels can change with time. There are case control studies where you look at draw the blood at time of diagnosis. Cross-sectional studies where you survey a large population, sort of go throughout the population and just look at people, find out their condition and their vitamin D levels, for example. And then ecological studies in which populations are defined geographically, and you can average both disease outcome and risk-modifying factors by region of study. The first epidemiological study hypothesizing that solar ultraviolet B radiation through production of vitamin D reduced the risk of cancer was an ecological study published in 1980 by the brothers Cedric and Frank Garland. They actually were beginning graduate students at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in 1974, and they looked at the new map of colon cancer mortality rates in the United States, which only had 5 different scales at that time. And the only cancer that leaped out of them and said there may be a sunshine effect was colon cancer. And they had just driven from San Diego to Baltimore, and they knew it was very sunny in the Southern California and Arizona and New Mexico, and not very sunny in Baltimore. And they knew that one of the important physiological effects of sunlight was vitamin D production, so they just hypothesized that sunlight through production of vitamin D reduced the risk of cancer. It took them 6 years to get that paper published because the mainstream journals just didn't want to handle it. It was finally a British journal, the International Journal of Epidemiology, that finally published it in 1980. So hats off to the British. Here is a more recent version of the map they looked at. This now has 10 different color scales. Dark red is high risk, high mortality rate, up to 30 deaths per 100,000 per year. Dark blue is low, down as low as 9 deaths per 100,000 per year. Overlaid are contours of annual solar radiation, and you can see at the lowest are up in the New York State area. The highest are in the New Mexico area. And there's a rough correspondence between annual solar radiation and mortality rate, an inverse correlation. They also identified breast cancer as UVB vitamin D sensitive in 1989-1990. You see the pattern is very similar, although the western states are somewhat different. They also identified ovarian cancer around 1992 as UVB sensitive, vitamin D sensitive. Again, that's similar, a little bit of difference in the upper states. Now, look at gastric cancer. That's also similar to the others, although along the border with Mexico, there are elevated gastric cancer rates, and that's because we have a lot of Mexicans and Central Americans living along the border. And it turns out that they have a much higher infection rate of H. pylori there, and bring it up to California and Arizona, New Mexico. So that has to be factored into the analysis. And if you look, there are other hot spots here and there. Here's corpus uteri or endometrial cancer. Again, it's similar to the others. So so in 1999, when these papers were, the new atlas was published, I looked at them and I saw the great similarity between many types of cancer. And at first I was a little naive and I thought, well, maybe, I'd just been studying diet and Alzheimer's disease, diet and prostate cancer, diet and colon cancer, diet and heart disease, and I thought I could do an ecological study on cancer in the United States. Well, it didn't take more than about a week to realize that Americans pretty much eat the same food throughout the entire country. We eat at McDonald's and shop at Safeway and get the same diet. So then I had to go back to the paper by the Garland brothers and proceed from there. And I worked for NASA at the time and actually got to fly around the world and measure ozone and aerosols using a laser system. And I was aware of the NASA total ozone mapping spectrometer instrument that had measured surface solar UVB in the United States for July 1992. And what you see here is that the highest rates, where the yellow and the lavender are, is in the southwest. The lowest dose is in the northeast, up in Maine. And it turns out that there are two primary reasons for that, or maybe three reasons. One is that the surface elevation in the west is somewhat higher than in the east, so there's less atmosphere to scatter the UVB. The second is that prevailing westerly winds went across the Rocky Mountains, and in doing so they push the tropopause higher, make the stratospheric ozone layer thinner, and so you have less absorption of UVB in the west, especially in the southwest. And third thing, you have more clouds and aerosols in the northeast. So these all conspire to give an asymmetrical UVB pattern, which is very, very useful, because one of the criticisms of the ecological approach is that it often just uses latitude as the index of UVB and vitamin D. But here is an asymmetrical pattern which works for cancer in the United States. And the IRC conveniently forgot to mention this paper when they did their review of vitamin D and cancer, and I took them to task for that in a rebuttal in 2009. So one can take the pictures like this, which have about 500 state economic areas, and one can digitize this map and then do correlations between the UVB and the cancer mortality rates. And I published this one in 2002, which is for breast cancer, and you see it has one slope at low levels and then flattens out above about 7 kilojoules per meter squared. For colon cancer, it seems to keep going, doesn't flatten out quite as much. Ovarian cancer is similar. Corpus uteri cancer, similar. Gastric cancer. Now I've cut off gastric cancer at 7.5 kilojoules per square meter as opposed to going out to 10 for these, because you have the high rates in the sunny areas, which is an artifact of having the people infected with H. pylori living there. So after the first publication, the head of epidemiology at the American Cancer Society, Michael Toon, said, well, that's interesting, but you haven't included the other cancer risk modifying factors. So I put in smoking, alcohol consumption, Hispanic heritage, because white Americans include Hispanic as well as non-Hispanic, urban residents and poverty, redid the analysis and found that